Well, my name's Greg Stamer, president of Kayak USA, and I've been using a Greenland paddle for almost 20 years. And I wanted to explain a few of the differences between, say, a Euro stroke and a Greenland stroke. In Euro tradition, you would expect to hold a Greenland paddle with all your fingers on the loom or the paddle shaft, and that's how we actually held them until the Greenlanders corrected us. And you can see the difference when you hold a blade in that manner. The blade's aligned vertically. However, when the Maligiaq and other Greenlanders came, they actually corrected us and said you hold the blade with only 2 fingers around the loom, the rest of your hand at the roots of the blade, and that causes the blade to tilt forward. And it tilts forward simply because with a neutral wrist, your hand is also tilted forward. And this tilted blade with a diving angle, the canted blade stroke, is a very popular method of paddling in Greenland. Certainly not the only one, but very, very popular. Another difference between Euro technique and Greenland technique involves the length of this blade. Now, as you probably know, the surface area of a Greenland paddle is roughly comparable to a lot of European paddles. However, the surface area is spread out, which means that when you get this blade in, it takes a little more time to fully immerse the blade. Sometimes that can mean less shock to your body, which helps for long distance. But a disadvantage is you have to sink this whole blade. So with a Greenland paddle, that means you have to get this blade in quickly and cleanly. No matter what paddle type, that is true. But with these, if you take a long time to get the blade immersed, your stroke's going to be over before you've even fully wetted your blade. So a good technique with these is using this diving angle. As you rotate in a position, simply slice it down. Or you can use a spear of the salmon technique that's very popular with wing paddlers, and that's to use your upper hand. Imagine there's a fish there, and just laterally slice the blade into the water. Another thing is the power, in terms of application of power, is completely different between a European paddle and a Greenland paddle. A European paddle, often it's taught you get maximum force quickly and right up front, and then you release the blade at your hip. With a Greenland paddle, the blade actually goes in more gently, the blade accelerates, and power is built more during the exit. So if you change these blades, if you're used to, say, a European approach, you would put a Greenland paddle in, expect full force, and then you'd be pulling it out at the hip. You're actually losing the main power. You're expecting maximum bite while the power is still building, and you're pulling the blade out of the water before the maximum power has actually built. So in Greenland, you'll actually see, instead of pulling this blade out at your hip, that the blade is a long, flowing stroke. Your hands will end at your hip, but because this blade is so long, it will always exit well behind your hip. Notice the paddle's coming out well behind him. So in a Greenland stroke, there is no effort made to artificially pull the paddle out early. And actually, you are lifting water at the end of a Greenland stroke. However, you're lifting with a tilted blade, which is very similar to how a sculling stroke would work. It's just happening from underneath. So you're lifting water, but as you lift, the water runs off the back. It gives you a boost forward. So there's a balance point to be made. But this happens naturally anyway as you're preparing to stroke on the next side. 2 variations. You can try simply lifting straight up, or as Maligiaq will teach you from his grandfather, as you lift straight up, let the paddle actually exit in a feathered way moving forward, and that has some advantages in rough seas and in wind. There's a lot of confusion that I see as well between how high do you hold a Greenland paddle. When we first started using these years ago, before we had the input of the Greenlanders, as I mentioned before, we were holding all of our fingers on the shaft, so the blades fell straight up and down, and we were taught from very early on that the paddle has to exit at the hip. So we were doing a very short, choppy stroke. And as the Greenlanders came, we learned to make that stroke longer. But another thing we learned is that we were always holding the paddle low on the deck. And the first training camp I went to, I was asked why I was doing that, and it was expressed that the height of your paddle you can think of in terms of like the gears on a bicycle or the accelerator of your car. If you want to move at a fairly slow but efficient pace, you can keep the paddle low. For regular touring, a lot of Greenlanders hold the paddle at about a 45-degree angle, and if you need to sprint, then this blade will come very close to the side of the kayak. So use the paddle to its full expression. What do you think about this paddle?
It is most world's stupid paddle.
My name is George Gronseth, and I started kayaking somewhere around 1980. It's best to look at the Greenland paddle and the kayak and the techniques all as a system. And so the Greenland paddle really works best with a Greenland kayak. Part of the design of a Greenland paddle is that you can hold it with your hand out on the blade. And so if my boat were tending to, to be steering that direction, say, due to the wind, what I might do is take a normal Greenland stroke on one side, slide the hand out on the blade, and take a wider sort of sweeping stroke on the other side. At the end of that stroke, I can move my hand back to its normal position and repeat normal stroke here, and if necessary, a sliding stroke out there, and keep going along like that. And it feels very natural to do that with a Greenland paddle. You can do it even with Western paddles, but with a Greenland paddle, because of the shape of the blade and all, you know where your hand is, and you don't always have to go out this far. Sometimes I'll find myself doing it automatically when I'm paddling in the wind. I'm making those corrections without even thinking about it. And often it only takes just an inch or two of sliding the hand in and out to make that correction for minor weathercocking. And not all Greenland paddles have a shoulder like this one does between the blade and the shaft, but I like ones that do, because that way, after I've had my hand out on the blade, I don't have to look at it again to make sure that my hand's right at that spot for the rest of the normal strokes.
What to do? I tried some stupid, so I took an out.
Open hand, yeah.
And what he's showing now, that's taught in whitewater as well. Again, it lets blood flow, it improves your circulation. But one thing I do want to make a note of is that whereas with a Euroblade you'd be holding your hands quite wide, notice to take a vertical stroke, I'm having to lift my elbows on each stroke. With a Greenland blade, your hands are closer together, so you can let the blades go high, but notice my elbows are not having to go very high. And an important thing to think of with that is a lot of us may spend hundreds of dollars to buy a carbon paddle or make it from the lightest wood, but the average arm of a man, according to John Heath, is about 11 pounds. So even though you have a 14-ounce paddle, if you're lifting this arm on every stroke, that's 11 pounds on top of your lightweight carbon paddle. I used a Greenland paddle for my trip around Iceland, and I thought it was an excellent paddle. I'm surprised that more Greenland paddles haven't been used on long trips and expeditions. These are a true sea kayak touring paddle. They're made to maximize your snicker bars per miles, if you will. In rough weather, with proper technique, you get extremely good bracing. But there's no paddle I'd rather have for extremely rough conditions. These are not racing paddles, so if you use a wing paddle, you're probably gaining an advantage. However, when things get rough, these paddles really come into their own.
You're doing this way because when you're starting against wind, it's okay. Oh, I can do it! Oh my God!